Hello there, I'm Lloyd Evans and you're watching the John Cedars channel from The Bunker, and in this video we need to talk about the November 2019 JW Broadcasting episode, which was hosted by governing body member Gerrit Losch and governing body helper Izak Marais. Now there's quite a lot of material to discuss, so without further ado, let's roll the first clip.
Welcome to JW Broadcasting. This is my friend and co-host Izak Marais. Izak, what's in store for this month's program?
Thank you, Brother Lösch. Children learned.
That sounds exciting. Let's get started. This is the November 2019 edition of JW Broadcasting.
Now, obviously, there's nothing unusual about a JW Broadcasting episode where a governing body member has a governing body helper as a co-host, and it's a very kind of awkward dynamic between the two. They're not gelling, it's not natural, it's all very wooden, but I'm afraid this particular episode is even worse than usual. I actually don't think that Gerrit Losch is firing on all cylinders, and in all seriousness, I have heard rumours, just rumours at this stage, that health-wise, he's maybe not at his best. I've heard that he might even have some kind of Alzheimer's or dementia-like illness. So when I was watching this, I was anxious to see whether there was any kind of deterioration in Gerrit's style of presenting, and I have to say, kind of yes. Obviously, English isn't Gerrit Losch's first language. He's Austrian, so it would be unfair to expect absolutely flawless presentation from him in English. Even so, by his own standards, comparing his presentation with previous episodes where he has hosted, you have to say that it's very disjointed. And by the way, if Gerrit Losch is indeed suffering from dementia or Alzheimer's, I would never, make light of that. In fact, I really do have sympathy for anyone who struggles with that affliction. It's kind of one of those nightmare things where you think, if ever I were to have that, it would just be game over. So I do feel sorry for him from at least that perspective. But the question must be asked, if he is struggling so much on camera as he appears to be, irrespective of what the reason is, irrespective of whether he has Alzheimer's or dementia, why is he just being wheeled out just because he's a governing body member? Shouldn't these JW Broadcasting episodes be hosted by capable presenters irrespective of their rank in the organisation? As I've long argued, it's very clear that in Watchtower it's not about how capable you are as a presenter, it's about who you are and what your rank is.
Millions have benefited from the animated series Become Jehovah's Friend and many other Bible-based videos. Have you enjoyed getting to know Caleb and Sophia?
Not really, Izak, I have to say. The Caleb and Sophia cartoons are some of the most cringeworthy, some of the most manipulative and controlling material that the organisation has ever put out. It's very difficult to enjoy propaganda that is deliberately designed to shape the minds of children, making them fearful that if they don't pay attention at the meetings, then they're going to die the same way as people died in Noah's flood. Telling them that they need to give their ice cream money to Watchtower. Telling them that if they play with the wrong type of toy, they're making Jehovah sad.
Magic is bad. That's why Jehovah hates it. Do you really want to play with something that Jehovah hates?
Telling them to be judgmental and bigoted if a school friend happens to have two mommies.
And you know what? People can change. That's why we share his message. So, What can you say to Carrie?
Well, I could tell her about the paradise. I could tell her about the animals and the resurrection.
So no, this isn't material that is either enjoyable to watch or that Watchtower should be proud of, but I guess we're going to see a behind-the-scenes making of segment which will give us all the insights that we frankly don't need as to how these cartoons are put together.
When you watch the video, perhaps you've wondered, how does the governing body know that the video will turn out exactly right? How can they see and hear the video before it exists?
I have literally never wondered that.
Let's go behind the scenes and see how this works.
Animated videos, like those in this series Become Jehovah's Friend, have been helping young ones draw closer to their Heavenly Father for several years now.
Look, Mom, I'm rejoicing in the hope. Whee!
But did you know? What you see on the screen might last just a few short minutes, but it may involve weeks of work by a virtual army of volunteers. With so much time and expense involved in making an animated video, a lot of careful planning is required to avoid waste and keep the process running smoothly. Let's take a look at how effective use of pre-production tools help all these brothers and sisters work together to take a video from initial concept to final production. Under the direction of the teaching committee of the governing body, the work begins long before the artists even get started. They provide the direction on the theme that needs to be taught. Members of the animation team collaborate to develop the featured characters as well as plot structure, and work closely with writers and storyboard artists to develop the approved idea into a storyline.
Okay, so full disclosure, I'm not entirely disinterested in what we're seeing here, especially in light of the footage that I shared with you in my recent televangelism video. I shared a video that got leaked to JW Survey showing some very frank interviews and remarks. This was a behind closed doors meeting, if you will, at the Mount Ebo complex, which is essentially Watchtower's Hollywood, where they produce many of these videos. And Ken Flodine gave an interview in which he divulged that for the very first Caleb and Sophia videos, they were so desperate to hit their deadlines that they had Bethelites working 30-hour shifts and having the beds brought into the offices, I believe.
We have very difficult, hard due dates. And to make some of those dates, the brothers worked 30 hours straight on their computer. And we finally brought beds up into the department so that they could take a 2 or 3 hour nap and get back on their computer to finish it up. So it was just a beautiful thing. And look what it's done for the world.
And yet here we're being told, oh no, it's a really smooth operation. Well, I'm sure it is now. I'm sure now that they've realized how effective these cartoons are, they're giving a bit more thought to the process, and I doubt that they're now making Bethelites work 30-hour shifts. But in the context of that kind of revelation that Ken Flodine gave, it's interesting to see Watchtower pretending that everything that goes on behind the scenes is flawless and very well organized. And I just love seeing the footage there of the teaching committee. What's interesting is that when you see them all sat there, you have Ron Curzon, or Robo-Ron as I like to call him. You have David Schaefer sat next to him. You have William Malenfant and Ken Flodine. And then at the head of the table, you have Stephen Lett. Besides Stephen Lett, you have Anthony Morris. You then have Jeffrey Jackson. And to the far right there, you have Mark Numet. Now, what's interesting for me, I'm probably going to go into this in a bit more detail in a future video. It's not a pressingly urgent subject for me to talk about, but it seems to me that there are for want of a better word, super helpers, who seem to get more airtime and more time in front of the camera than other helpers. And I would suggest that the helpers that we're seeing here, especially Ron Curzon, David Schaefer and Ken Flodine, and arguably Mark Neumayer as well, if you actually go back and look at how many episodes these guys have either hosted or co-hosted, and how many morning worship videos of theirs are on JW Broadcasting, you quickly see that they're on a lot, more than, you could argue, many of the other helpers. And for me, it's surely no coincidence that these helpers happen to be on the teaching committee, which decides how the propaganda gets put together. So you can just imagine it's a case of, oh, well, you know, we'd really like to have this video dealing with this subject, or we'd really like this JW Broadcasting episode to deal with this issue. Who are we going to get to host this? And because Ken Flodine's there in the room, or David Schaefer's there in the room, it's a case of, oh, Ken, you'd be perfect for that. Or, oh, David, you'd be perfect for that. Even though Ken Flodine in particular, I would argue, is an appalling teacher. He has terrible teaching skills. Very, very unnatural. He comes up with the most convoluted visual aids. If you think back to the bread illustration that he gave, and the one as well where he smashes the misshapen glass. Now that you can see him sat there with governing body members on the teaching committee, it's fairly easy for me to understand how he gets shoved in front of the camera quite as much as he does. It's because he has a prominent place in Watchtower on the teaching committee, which has the responsibility for coming up with the ideas for many of these videos. So it's no surprise that someone like Ken, despite having terrible teaching skills, will end up being put in front of the camera a lot anyway.
The finished animatic is submitted to the teaching committee for review. Based on direction from the committee, the team makes sure that the teaching points come across clearly and that the finished product is true to the spirit and intent of the approved concept for the video. Finally, using the approved animatic as a blueprint, full production begins.
Really, everything in animation can be very time-consuming.
Huh?
An animator working full-time here at Bethel may be able to produce 4 to 6 seconds of animation in 1 week. And that doesn't even include other aspects that are very important, such as modeling, rigging, lighting, compositing, and many others.
From the examples shown here, you can see just how closely the final version of the video, Make Jehovah Happy, follows the animatic.
No!
Pre-production tools, such as storyboards and animatics, do more than save the organization time and money. They enable the teaching committee to carefully evaluate every project along the way, from the initial approved concept to the final product, in order to keep providing videos that help all of us honor our friend, Jehovah.
Isn't it amazing to see all the work that goes into our videos? Jehovah provides for his people just what they need at the right time.
So there's nothing amazing about the amount of work and the amount of time that goes into these animation videos, because it's in Watchtower's interests to invest that time, invest those resources, because they know their best chance of growing as an organization, or at least keeping their heads above water, is to make sure there's a steady stream of indoctrinated Jehovah's Witnesses being raised by their believing parents to compensate for the fact that they're bringing in virtually no one through the preaching work, as the figures bear out. I mean, we're waiting for the full 2019 figures at this moment, but certainly for the previous 2 years, the 2018 figures and the 2017 figures showed that it was only 1.4% increase. So this is an organization that's barely keeping its head above water. They know their best chance is to indoctrinate children, and they've figured out that at least one way of doing that is by creating these cartoons. And I might just add that I obviously keep Jessica away from this material like you wouldn't believe. But what's interesting is I have a Caleb and Sophia DVD on display in my collection. And whenever Jessica comes into the bunker, as she sometimes does, to see what Daddy's doing, she gravitates towards it. There's something about, I don't know, the colours and the fact that it's clearly a cartoon that really draws children in, even though, I mean, thankfully, she hasn't really been exposed to the actual cartoons themselves. She just finds the cover of the DVD interesting. It whets her appetite, I guess. But for me, just that reaction to the image of Caleb and the fact that it's a cartoon character, it really shows just how devious Watchtower is in exploiting children's interest in this particular medium of cartoons. To distort it in this way, because when most companies make cartoons, I'm sure they treat it as a product as well. It's, you know, cartoons are there to make money, but at least the actual content itself is there to entertain. And a lot of the cartoons that Jessica watches on Netflix, for example, are actually quite educational. She's actually learning useful things as she's watching these cartoons. Watchtower's cartoons are there for one reason and one reason alone, and that's to hijack young minds. So no, Izak, I can understand why you're proud of the fact that you have this machinery in place to churn out this content, but the content itself is grotesque. It serves a very evil, nefarious purpose, and it's certainly nothing to be proud of.
Brother Lösch, I know you have some thoughts on this.
I'd like to talk about a very common expression in the Bible. The expression is, I am with you. 13 times it's attributed to a statement from Jehovah. 3 times it's something that Jesus said to one or more of his disciples. Of course, there are dozens of other times that the same sentiment is expressed using similar wording. Few things in the world equal the joy humans experience than the birth of a child. As children grow up, they are sometimes exposed to situations that tend to cause nervousness or even fear. So a parent may occasionally feel compelled to reassure a child, "Have no fear, I am with you."
So we're now in Gerrit Losch's talk, in which he is discussing the concept of Jehovah being with his people. And I did just want to pick up on this analogy that he gives of parents being with their children or reassuring their children that they are with them, which isn't, I have to say, a conversation I have with Jessica all that often. But anyway, Gerrit Losch, who it should be pointed out isn't himself a parent, talks about how parental love is one of the strongest impulses that one can have in life. And I did find this a little bit jarring, because it's true that when you become a parent, your emotions almost get hacked, for want of a better word. You can't imagine before you have a child loving someone so profoundly, and then all of a sudden this child pops into existence, and your entire kind of, I don't know, emotional framework gets recalibrated, so that all of a sudden this new arrival is more important to you than anyone. And what's really sad to me when I see this kind of stock footage pop up, which is a really tedious aspect of JW broadcasting, they can't just talk about something without having to show it in some way. But here we're being asked to contemplate the idea of parents loving their children. And in the context of shunning, it really leaves a bad taste in the mouth, Because one of the things I've really struggled with since becoming a father is knowing how profoundly this reorientation of one's emotions affects you, so that, again, you can't imagine ever losing your bond with your child and ever casting them aside. And yet you look at, in my case, my dad, and the way he is just abandoned not just me but Deanna as well, and still hasn't met his grandchildren, and you think, how can you have felt what I'm feeling now and then just get rid of it, then just shed those emotions entirely? So I couldn't help but think of that when Gerrit Losch was saying this. Again, he's talking as someone who hasn't actually been in the position of having these feelings of overwhelming paternal love, and he's presiding over an organization that routinely destroys this love, breaks these paternal bonds, and makes it so that parents virtually forget that they had any children to begin with.
Think of the righteous man Noah. Genesis 6:9 says that Noah walked with the true God. There's no doubt that Jehovah was with Noah. He preserved him and his family through the flood. Afterward, Jehovah further proved he was with Noah. In Genesis chapter 9, Jehovah said, "I am now establishing my covenant with you. Never again will all flesh be destroyed by the waters of a flood." Jehovah could have made that determination and promised himself that he wouldn't do that again. But instead, he reached out to Noah and reassured him that he was with him by making the rainbow covenant with Noah and his offspring.
You might be watching this as someone who has never had anything to do with Jehovah's Witnesses. You're just interested in hearing more about the religion. And here you have an interesting insight into the kind of creationist undertones of the leadership, because Gerrit Losch, a governing body member, is here describing the account of Noah's flood as though it's an actual historical event, even though, for reasons that I needn't go into, hopefully you can just Google this, but we know for multiple reasons that Noah's flood, as described in the Bible, couldn't have happened. And yet again, here Gerrit Losch is looking into the camera with absolute certainty and describing it as though it's a historical event, even to the point where he's describing the rainbow covenant. And if you know anything about the story in the Bible, you'll know that God apparently created rainbows, even though this was supposed to be centuries after God had finished creating the earth and creating all the natural processes. He apparently created rainbows after the flood as a form of covenant with Noah to reassure humankind that he would never drown them again in punishment. So whenever we see a rainbow, we're supposed to remember Noah's flood, because that's how rainbows came into existence. You hear Gerrit Losch talking about this with, so deadpan, taking it so seriously, and you think, how did I swallow this? I mean, we know why rainbows form. We know about light particles and how they react and prisms and all that sort of thing. It's perfectly understandable from the point of view of physics that you would have rainbows, and yet we're supposed to believe that for centuries after humans came into existence, which apparently happened instantaneously in a garden in Turkey 6,000 years ago, but for centuries after humans came into existence, there were no rainbows. It was impossible for rainbows to be visible, which is one of the many things that you look back on after leaving behind a fundamentalist interpretation of the Bible and think, how on earth did I swallow that?
At times, we may come across someone who is angry and may even be threatening. This is the time to remember Jeremiah. Though initially timid, he courageously faced the challenge of an intimidating response. How did he rally to the occasion? It was because Jehovah had reassured him, "I am with you." He said, "I have put my words in your mouth." Does Jehovah do something similar for us? Yes. Long after Jeremiah and the other faithful ones that were recorded in the Hebrew Scriptures came and went, Jehovah has proved to be with true Christians, both past and present. Jesus was not alone during his most anxious moments. Jehovah was with him. If you think you are alone standing at the door of an irritated householder, think again. Jehovah is with you. You have more with you than if you had your whole congregation standing in the person's front yard. Do you recall that Jehovah told Jeremiah, "I have put my words in your mouth"? Can Jehovah do the same for us when we are opposed by unbelievers? The Christian Greek scriptures answer with a resounding yes. So what's the Holy Spirit's role when we are in an intimidating situation, when sharing the good news? Jehovah is with you. He uses his Holy Spirit to bring to the surface some of those precious gems that might be buried in your mind. You may be amazed at what you remember when put under pressure by the authorities or even by outright opposers. In this way, Jehovah is with you.
I found this part of Gerrit's talk interesting for two reasons. Firstly, it seems to be playing on this paranoid perception of opposers being aggressive and confrontational, which no doubt in some cases they are. I've long said that it's really sad when you see ex-Jehovah's Witnesses acting in a confrontational way towards witnesses who are, say, doing cart witnessing, thereby basically fulfilling all the stereotypes that Watchtower paints when it comes to opposers and apostates, which is what we see here. Gerrit Losch is here warning witnesses that this is exactly the sort of behavior they can expect from apostates and from opposers. So it's interesting to see this kind of, you could say, fear-mongering, where the governing body, in the form of Gerrit Losch, are building up this stereotype of opposers and warning witnesses that this is what they should expect. But I also found it quite hypocritical of Gerrit Losch in particular to be conveying this message that witnesses need to have no fear when they are required to defend the organization or defend their beliefs, perhaps to the authorities, which he mentions there. Because in such situations, don't worry, you're going to be inspired to say the right thing. Jehovah's going to be with you. He's going to guide you through the whole thing. So there's no reason to be afraid. You've got this. Jehovah is with you. This would sound unremarkable coming from almost any other governing body member other than Gerrit Losch. And I say that because, if you didn't already know, Gerrit Losch has, in a very cowardly way, got out of a subpoena to appear before a court by effectively disavowing any role with Watchtower. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, I'll put a link in the description to a statement, an affidavit that was released by Gerrit Losch in 2014 in response to this subpoena to appear in the Jose Lopez trial. Jose Lopez was a victim of child sex abuse at the hands of Gonzalo Campos, who was a prolific sex offender. He accumulated many victims, and Jose Lopez's lawyer subpoenaed Gerrit Losch because Gerrit Losch is the longest serving governing body member. And in trying to weasel his way out of appearing in this trial, Gerrit Losch said the following: "I am not, and never have been, a corporate officer, director, managing agent, member, or employee of Watchtower. I do not direct and have never directed the day-to-day operations of Watchtower. I do not answer to Watchtower. I do not have and never have had any authority as an individual to make or determine corporate policy for Watchtower or any department of Watchtower. Watchtower does not have and never has had any authority over me." Now, you'll notice that he was very clever with his wording. So, for example, he said, "I have never had any authority as an individual," knowing full well that he certainly did have authority as a member of the governing body over Watchtower. So he was very clever with his use of words. But even despite doing all of these gymnastics with word games, etc., you could say that what Gerrit Losch was saying here was dishonest, was disingenuous. If you were an ordinary Jehovah's Witness and you were to stand up in the Kingdom Hall and say, "I do not answer to Watchtower. Watchtower does not have and never has had any authority over me," you can imagine what the reaction would be. You would be frog-marched into the back room by the elders fairly quickly, I would suspect. And yet it's one rule for the rank and file, another rule for a governing body member who's desperately trying to crawl out of answering for the organisation in a child sex abuse lawsuit. And yet Gerrit Losch has the audacity and the hypocrisy to get in front of the camera in this JW Broadcasting episode and tell witnesses to have courage and be bold in answering for their beliefs and answering on behalf of the organisation.
As prophesied during this time of the conclusion of the system, we are being persecuted in different areas of the world. As the scriptures show, Satan and his angels are misleading the entire inhabited earth. Recently, Jehovah's people have been persecuted in Russia. But will the persecution succeed in eliminating true worship in that area of the world? No. Why not? It's because Jehovah is with them. He and Jesus promised, "I am with you." Russia did not learn from the past. It will prove to be the same for them as it was for Nazi Germany under Hitler. Hitler thought his regime could eradicate true worship and God's people from areas under their control, but they made a big mistake. While it is true they murdered some 2,000 brothers, in the end, their scheme ended up in failure. Why? Because God was with us, not with them. God with us? Those words have decorated national emblems and even the uniforms of soldiers of Prussia and the Tsarist Russian Empire. These words were also on the belts of German troops when they marched into Belgium in the year 1914 of our common era. But they had it wrong. The sovereign Lord Jehovah was with us, not with them. He's with all of us now. He'll be with us during Armageddon. He'll be with us after Armageddon. He'll be with us at the end of the 1,000-year reign of Christ. He'll be with mankind at the end of 100,000 years. He'll be with humans at the end of 100 million years, and at the end of 100 million years times 100 million years. Jehovah will be with mankind forever, and so will Jesus. They are both on record as saying, "I am with you."
Quite remarkable little display of, you could say, emotion there by Gerrit Losch, coming up with some big numbers as to how far into eternity Jehovah is going to be with his people, I was interested more than anything in two things, really. First of all, he was talking there about Gott mit uns, and the fact that those words adorned the belt buckles of German troops in both World War One and World War Two. He doesn't really mention the Third Reich there, but those words were also on the belt buckles of Nazi officers. For me, that whole story, the fact that then even the Nazis could claim that God was on their side, should be a cautionary tale for people like Gerrit Losch, to remind them that just because they say God is on their side doesn't mean that God is on their side. You can do some pretty evil things, we've learned, claiming to have God on your side. Just because you're making that claim doesn't make it so. And yet Gerrit Losch just says, oh, well, they didn't have God on their side. We do have God on our side. We, being an organization that breaks apart families through shunning, persuades people to die rather than accept blood transfusions, and covers up child sex abuse on an industrial scale. We're the ones who have God on our side, not the Nazi officers who were carrying out the Holocaust and that sort of thing. It's just ridiculous, quite frankly. But also you have this reveling in persecution. I've said before, I've called it persecution porn. They seem to love the idea of witnesses getting persecuted, and you have here fighting talk almost from Gerrit Losch towards Russia, saying, oh, you're making the exact same mistake that Hitler made. You don't know what you're up against. We will prevail. True worship will prevail in Russia. Gerrit Losch knows from experience that persecution can stir up people's emotions, can stir up the emotions of Jehovah's Witnesses, and convince them that they are part of God's one and only true organization, because of course God's true organization is supposed to be persecuted. And oh, wonderful, here's a country, here's a regime that's persecuting us. There's your evidence. If only totalitarian regimes like Putin's could get it into their heads that what they are doing is helping the organization, not hampering it. In the case of Jehovah's Witnesses, they are validating everything that the organization says will happen to their followers. And just as you would expect, not only have the organization enshrined the actions of one country into their understanding of Bible prophecy, so that Russia is now again the king of the north, and all of this was apparently prophesied in the book of Daniel, but they're also repeatedly referring to Russia in video after video after video after video, precisely because they know that this plays well for stirring up emotions and for motivating witnesses. Before we move on to the next segment, though, I do just also want to fact-check Gerrit Losch, because he says at one point that 2,000 Jehovah's Witnesses were murdered under the Nazi regime.
Hitler thought his regime could eradicate true worship and God's people from areas under their control, but they made a big mistake. While it is true they murdered some 2,000 brothers, in the end, the scheme ended up in failure.
I don't know what figures Gerrit Losch is referring to, but I actually researched this quite extensively when I was writing The Reluctant Apostate, using various sources, including the excellent work of Jim Penton, his book Jehovah's Witnesses and the Third Reich. I'm just looking at it in my collection. That book in particular is a fantastic resource in learning more about what happened to Jehovah's Witnesses over these years. But there weren't 2,000 casualties, it was actually 1,200. So, 1,200 is still a big number, but it's not 2,000. I'm curious to know why Gerrit Losch is exaggerating that number, but it was actually 1,200, and of those 1,200, it was 250 witnesses were outright executed for being witnesses. The rest died in concentration camps in custody through maltreatment. So that's the true number, 1,200. Don't let Gerrit Losch convince you otherwise.
Today, Jehovah is with his people everywhere. We're going to see examples of this next. First is the experience of Adam and Nancy Solomon. When they came into the truth, they faced bitter opposition from their families. Notice how Jehovah was with them during this stressful time.
My family are Hungarian Jews. Most of them were killed in concentration camps. That's something that the Holocaust took from me. They took the concept of family. I needed explanations. I needed to know why my family was murdered. It made me really search at a very young age to see if there was a real religion out there. It was just a secular thing to be Jewish. It was a cultural thing. A friend of mine came up to me and said, "I have to tell you something. I got this book from one of Jehovah's Witnesses. It is the most beautiful book I have ever read." I said, "Oh, I'll read it." And it couldn't have been a week later that I got a knock on my door. And there were two young women at the door who started to talk to me about the Bible.
Now, I don't know whether you've seen my rebuttal to the September JW Broadcasting episode, which was hosted by David Splain. I don't want to repeat myself too much, but if you check out that episode and see what I have to say about this particular book, The Truth That Leads to Eternal Life, I found it interesting that the lady who gives this testimonial referred to this book and how wonderful it is. As I mentioned in that previous rebuttal, what's interesting about this book is that it was re-released and edited to try and cover up for the fact that it pointed strongly towards 1975, in harmony with the thinking at the time that Armageddon would come in that year. So it was interesting that they referenced that book. But this testimonial is interesting to me mainly because of how disingenuous it is. I mean, we're here talking in the context of the Holocaust, and this lady says, that's one thing the Holocaust took from me. It took from me the concept of family. And she's saying those words in a JW Broadcasting episode that is promoting an organization that breaks apart families. That's probably the most disturbing thing about this testimonial. You have here Watchtower trying to sell the idea that they're all about love, they're all about family. If anyone's trying to break apart families, if anyone's being unloving, it's concerned relatives and concerned family members who are reacting with frustration when they learn that their family member is getting involved with Jehovah's Witnesses, as we're going to see as this testimonial unfolds. It's just deeply disingenuous to see the way they are reframing the whole issue of family and love in this testimonial. But also the lady who's giving this testimonial says, oh, well, a friend gave me this book, and it couldn't have been a week later when I received a knock at the door. It couldn't have been a week later. You're saying it was a few days later that you got a knock on the door from a group that makes it its business to call on as many doors as possible. And you're thinking this is somehow strange. I was actually listening to this thinking, well, who's to say that the friend who gave her the truth book and said, this is an amazing book, didn't subsequently hand over the lady's details to the local congregation so that they could call round. But even if that didn't happen, even if it was just a coincidence, I don't think that there's anything remarkable about a group that literally calls on homes systematically and tries to cover every home in the territory frequently, just happening to call on someone who's been given a book to read. But we're going to see this bizarre claim that Jehovah somehow orchestrates events so that people like this lady get called on. We're going to see that sort of claim get repeated in this broadcasting episode.
Once I started having a study on a regular basis with Carolyn, I enjoyed it more and more. One day, my father was home. He just screamed at them and basically threw them out of the house. It just progressed after that. There was just no peace at any time, and lots of tears. And I just couldn't understand why they weren't even asking me, well, what is it that you like about this religion? Who are these people? Let us talk to... No, nothing. It was very, very hard. Shortly after my baptism, my mother came up to me and she said, your father and I are going out for the day. You better not be here when we get home. I was 17 years old. I didn't know where I was going to go. I didn't know what I was going to do. But I trusted in Jehovah, and I picked up the phone and I called my Carolyn. In what seemed like minutes, there were brothers and sisters at the house. They were putting my things into this truck, bringing it over to Carolyn's house, and she said, you can live with me.
Just incredibly distasteful. It's almost as though there is no such thing as shunning in Jehovah's Witnesses. There is no such thing as kicking out teenagers who are old enough to fend for themselves, kicking out 17, 18, 19-year-olds because they've committed the unthinkable horror of having consensual sex with someone outside of wedlock. Oh, well, in that case, if you're disfellowshipped, we can't talk to you, and we're going to pretend that we're not your parents and we're going to throw you out. Apparently none of that is happening, and we should focus instead on a lady who just happened to have an extreme reaction from her parents to her getting involved in a cult. And quite frankly, it's understandable that her parents would be frustrated. I'm not condoning the way they reacted. I think that, if anything, from what she's describing, and she could be giving a biased picture of what happened, but if we take what she's saying on face value, they made the situation far worse than it needed to be if they weren't willing to sit down with her and try and reason her through what was happening, try and reason her through some of the claims that she was being asked to accept, and try to show some kind of interest in the process. By being entirely disinterested and entirely dismissive of her discoveries, you could say, they only pushed her deeper into the cult. But even if they completely mishandled this situation and dealt in an unloving way with this lady, there's no excuse for pretending that this is some kind of norm, especially when you are an organization that routinely forces families apart, routinely forces parents to shun their children in exactly the way that this lady is describing.
I had questions. I asked them, why did we die? Why did we grow old? So forth and so on. And they went right to the Bible. And when I left the house after that, I said, this is the truth. Growing up in my house, going to church every Sunday was something that you had to do. But when I became a teenager, then religion became less in my life and basketball became more. Being a young man, you watch sports and you see the sports players made a lot of money. My teachers would tell my parents that he's going to be a good basketball player, take care of him. He could be worth, several $100,000 by the time he graduates. I received over 125 scholarships. Now you're talking about a free education just because you can play basketball. So I realized, at an early age that playing professional basketball could mean a lot, not only for me, but for my family. So as far as God was concerned, I had a little interest in God. Like I would ask my mom questions, but it wasn't until Nancy brought me to the Witnesses that really something just kicked in. I was studying, and my mom, she was downstairs in the basement. I heard her crying. I said, what's wrong? And she said, I know you're going to become one of those Jehovah's Witnesses. So realizing in my mind that I'm not going to become a basketball player, I'm going to become one of Jehovah's Witnesses because that's more important, that affected me many, many times. When others found out that I was going to become one of Jehovah's Witnesses, people shied away. people try to use you when they think you can give them something or you're going to be somebody big to go to the direction of serving Jehovah completely. You lost all the worldly people that you thought were your friends.
So we're now hearing from the husband, and again, the narrative that Watchtower is pushing seems to be, oh, we are victims of shunning. People who join our organisation are victims of shunning by worldly people, by worldly family members who react with horror when they learn that their son or daughter is getting involved with our group. You cannot compare in any way, shape or form what individuals do when they learn that their son or daughter is joining a group. You cannot compare that with an organisation that orders individuals to treat their children or treat their loved ones in that way. There is a huge difference between individuals who shun of their own volition and individuals who shun because they are ordered to by an organisation on pain of death at a future Armageddon if they don't demonstrate their loyalty. And what Watchtower's trying to do with these testimonials, or with this particular testimonial, is blur the lines between the two. It's a smoke and mirrors trick to try and con people into thinking that Jehovah's Witnesses are victims of shunning by intolerant people who react badly when they learn that people are interested in the organisation. Look, first of all, we're not hearing from this guy's parents or from the previous parents as to what they think about the whole situation and what their recollections were. But even if we give it to this guy that his parents reacted badly and reacted in an unkind or intolerant way, that was their doing. That was their decision. They weren't being ordered to do that by Satan's system of things.
And then we decided to get married. The scripture that says that even if my own father and my mother would abandon me, that even Jehovah would take me in, it proved to be true in so many ways. Once you become one of Jehovah's Witnesses, you're part of a family that will do anything for you. We've had adversity over the years, but Jehovah never said everything is going to be perfect. What he said is, when you face these problems, you will not face them alone. And Jehovah has never let us down when it comes to that.
When their families and friends abandoned them, did you notice how Jehovah continued to be with Adam and Nancy? Their spiritual family immediately stepped in to support them. I appreciated what Nancy said. Jehovah never said everything will be perfect. He said that when you face problems, you will not face them alone. She and Adam never felt alone.
Isn't it disgusting the way this story, the story of Adam and Nancy, is being deliberately used to again give this counter-narrative? This is Watchtower's attempt at staving off criticism over its horrendous, deadly shunning policy, which in some cases we know has led people to commit suicide. Because as humans, we're just not designed to deal with ostracism. We're not designed to deal with people we care about suddenly abandoning us over something we have no control over, perhaps a loss of faith. And Watchtower's answer, rather than to apologise, rather than to say, maybe we have gone too far, maybe we ought to revisit this shunning policy, is to give this sort of juvenile answer where they say, oh, well, just look at Adam and Nancy. They were shunned for wanting to become Jehovah's Witnesses, so it's the same thing. Absolutely disgraceful. I think especially when Nancy says, when you become a Jehovah's Witness, you become part of a family that would do anything for you. or words to that effect. That is just completely not true. This is a family that will drop you like a ton of bricks the minute you stop believing. Actually, you can still be believing and you'll get dropped like a ton of bricks simply for being marked as bad association, simply for not doing everything that's required of you. You could still be a believing Jehovah's Witness and cut back on your meetings and cut back on preaching work, or be seen watching films that you're not supposed to watch, or maybe your trousers are a bit too tight, or maybe you've got a beard. Let's just see, shall we, how the family rallies round, how the family reacts to that sort of behaviour. We all know, Jehovah's Witnesses watching this know, that that's not how it works. The love that Jehovah's Witnesses feel in their family is entirely conditional. And if you're not in this family, you're worthy of, first of all, ostracism and shunning, but ultimately you're worthy of death. If Armageddon were to come and you're in this disapproved state, you're not putting your worship of Jehovah first, you're not demonstrating loyalty in one of the many ways that Watchtower insists, you're worthy of annihilation. That's the family Nancy wants us to join.
Often we ask Jehovah to be with us when we need something, a spiritual need or a material need. But as we'll see in this next experience, even before we know that we have a need, Jehovah already knows what we need.
My name is Rita. My son is Jackson, and my daughter is Sharina. It's just the three of us. I have been working in a tea estate as a tea picker. One day I prayed to God very hard. I said, "Please, help me to learn about the Bible." Within 2 days, Jehovah's Witnesses came and knocked on my door, and I agreed to study the Bible. I couldn't believe it. I only prayed yesterday, asking God to help me to study the Bible. Our meetings begin at 4:45, but we have to get ready by 12 o'clock to attend the meetings. So we prepare our bags on Wednesday night. I carry 2 big bags on my shoulders and walk for 3.5 kilometers to get to the meetings on time. We love seeing our brothers. That's why we always go to the meetings early.
Okay, first things first, I've got to know what she's carrying around in these bags. Because one of those bags looks massive. Looks like she's going on holiday somewhere. The other bag you can kind of understand if you're going to the meeting, but what on earth is in that second bag? I mean, maybe I'm zooming in on something trivial, but this is actually a point that they seem to stress in this testimonial. But all joking aside, let's get to the serious part of this. Here we are being introduced to a Jehovah's Witness in Sri Lanka who is being wheeled out by Watchtower to impress us all over how Jehovah cares for his people. And there's going to be another interesting example given, but the first example we are given here is of Rita praying to learn about the Bible, and within 2 days, Jehovah's Witnesses contact her. And you hear, we hear this particular kind of anecdote multiple times in this JW Broadcasting episode, but it's just such a clearly debunkable anecdote. I mean, 2 days, that's supposed to impress us? If she'd been praying, and then the very next second, or within 10 seconds, there's a knock at the door, maybe that would be impressive. But even then, and she's saying 2 days is impressive, Jehovah's Angels are supposed to move at lightning speed, aren't they? What were they doing? Taking a coffee break? when she was first praying. And I suppose it's time to get someone to call on Rita now. Shouldn't we be saving people from this earthquake, or that child's about to drop dead from starve? No, Rita needs witnesses to call to give her a Bible study. So never you mind about that child that's about to die of starvation. Priorities. Apparently, this is what's going on in heaven. But if it had been 10 seconds after Rita had finished uttering her prayer, even that wouldn't have been convincing if you think about it, because Jehovah's Witnesses, granted they're probably not in such high concentrations in Sri Lanka, I will give you that. But when you have an organisation that makes it its business to cover as much of its territory as possible, offering its version of what the Bible says and what the Bible demands, it's inevitable that some people are going to pray, and within a relatively close time scale, a witness is going to call on them. You can't put that down to divine intervention, to the doings of the angels. And frankly, even if you can, what does that tell us about God if this is his priority? If his priority is making sure someone like Rita gets indoctrinated into a cult, while there are 9 million children every year dying before they can reach the age of 5.
One time, I was not paid at all. I didn't even have a rupee. On that day, my children and I ate well. But after eating, we were very worried about what we were going to do the following day. So that night, I said a prayer with the kids and we read the Bible. Jesus said, "Don't worry about tomorrow." So I trusted that somehow Jehovah would give us what we needed. It was 10:30 at night. I was fast asleep and the phone rang. Usually, no one calls this late. So I wondered who could be calling me this late. I picked up the phone and it was a brother on the line. He said, "Sister, go to your bookshelf and take the Greatest Man book." Then he asked me to turn to a page. When I turned to that page, there was 10,000 rupees between those pages. We could not believe our eyes. It was exactly what we needed for that month's expenses. A few days earlier, he and his wife had visited us and secretly left the money in the book before leaving. So I thanked Jehovah in prayer with the kids. Jehovah already knows exactly what we needed, even before we realized it.
We're going from the sublime to the ridiculous here. First of all, we're expected to believe that angels were responsible, or Jehovah's Spirit was responsible in some way for Rita getting offered a Bible study within 2 days of her praying for one. And now Jehovah is in the business of handing out cash on an extremely discriminate basis. He obviously doesn't do this to everyone, but Rita gets this phone call at 10:30. What is the significance of that, by the way? They labour on that point as well, like they laboured on the point of her having big bags. They labour on the point of, the phone call was at 10:30. I never receive phone calls at 10:30. Oh, thank you for that information, and hopefully I'll find a way of using that information. So she gets this phone call. A guy has left money in her book, in her Greatest Man book, and wants to finally let her in on the secret. Big deal. Someone has given her money and thought of an imaginative way of giving her that money. You're telling us this is Jehovah's doing? Again, why is Jehovah in the business of acting like some kind of ATM machine on very selective cases for a particular religion with a particular set of leaders in upstate New York, while all of this unimaginable suffering is happening on a daily basis? Children are dying of goodness knows what. You know, the tragedies you read about when you flick through the news and you hear of someone dying from something that was entirely preventable. A kid, for example, and this is by no means the worst story that you'll read, but there was the story of I think the 19-year-old boy who was on his motorbike in the UK, and an American ambassador's wife pulled out from an American army base, on the wrong side of the road and killed him. And there's a whole story behind it because she claimed diplomatic immunity. But the parents have to cope with the fact that their 19-year-old boy is no longer alive, was alive one day, isn't alive the next, just riding his motorbike in a perfectly normal way, and he's killed over something that was entirely preventable. Why isn't God sorting that problem out? Oh, instead, no, Rita needs her 10,000 rupees. And that's just one example of an unbeliever who dies in an entirely preventable way. Again, angels have nothing to do about it. What about the believers? What about people within the Jehovah's Witness organization suffering on a daily basis? You're telling me that angels see children being molested within Jehovah's organization and won't stop that. They won't stop a child from being molested by a believing Jehovah's Witness, maybe an elder. They won't stop that happening. But, oh, Rita needs her 10,000 rupees. Even if we hand it all to Rita and say, yes, Jehovah absolutely gave you your 10,000 rupees because it was in the Greatest Man book, where are the priorities? It baffles me. And I've always had this problem when it comes to, and again, I don't want to, make believers feel bad, but I think it's best summed up by the Tim Minchin song, Thank You, God.
And I will say thank you, thank you, thank you, God, thank you, thank you.
If you're a believer and you fancy kind of challenging yourself a little bit, just listen to that song, Thank You, God. And it just perfectly sums up the problem that I and others have when it comes to an interventionist God or a selectively interventionist God. It's easier to respect God if he doesn't intervene at all. But if he's going to intervene in such extremely selective ways, ignoring unimaginable suffering and millions of deaths, but intervening in ways like this, it's harder to respect a God who would do that. So no, Rita, I'm not impressed by your 10,000 rupees. And incidentally, I did a quick conversion on Google because I wanted to know how much was 10,000 Sri Lankan rupees when converted into dollars. Turns out it's just over 55 United States dollars. I wonder how far $55 would go with Toni Morris in Bottle King.
Honestly, every night I open the doors, go outside, and look up at the night sky. When I look up, I see many stars. I daily meditate about His wisdom, His power, what amazing things He is able to do. This earth, this universe, how amazingly well He cares for them. He takes care of the smallest thing. I completely rely on Jehovah. And then I remember that Jehovah has the ability to help us with His Holy Spirit. He is such a loving Father. He is always holding our hand tight, and no one can separate us from Him. If anyone tries, they would fail. He's so generous with His love. He's so affectionate with us. No one can take away the love Jehovah has for us.
I've included this material pretty much because it perfectly demonstrates the tried and trusted formula that these JW Broadcasting episodes follow. Include an emotional testimonial. And we've had Rita's stories about being called on within 2 days of praying, about how Jehovah gave her 10,000 rupees. And now she is expressing her adoration for God as a creator, as someone who has made all the stars. Look, you can believe that if you want to. There are many people who believe in a creationist, theist deity. It doesn't get you to being a Jehovah's Witness. How do you get from saying, oh, God created everything, to God's name is Jehovah and He chose the faithful slave invisibly in 1919 and the organization is now based in Warwick headquarters in upstate New York? How do you get to that? There's no evidence at all to support those claims. And yet Rita, because of her emotional attachment to the organization, because she's been manipulated, because she's been love-bombed, because she's been, frankly, given money and kindness, all of a sudden the need for evidence is less. The need to get to the truthfulness of the claims is less. Because it's not about evidence, it's not about truth, it's not about facts, it's about how she feels.
Rita really appreciates congregation meetings. They love being with their brothers. How about you? Do you value the meetings and the encouraging association you find there?
Why should meetings be all about association and encouragement? If that's the reason why witnesses go to meetings, to get love-bombed, essentially, is that a valid reason to be going to meetings? I ask this in case you're watching this as someone who is a Jehovah's Witness. I've made the point before that if something's true, you shouldn't need to be reminded of it twice a week. Once you learn something that's true, provided you don't have serious problems with your memory, it sticks. What you find, though, with organizations like Jehovah's Witnesses is that it doesn't stick because it's nonsense. So they need to make people keep going to meetings week in, week out, so that eventually, even though it's nonsense, it will stick. This is what indoctrination's all about. This is what makes indoctrination different from learning. Because when you learn something, either at school or at college or university, you don't need to be reminded of it on a weekly basis. You just learn it, and that's because it makes sense, rather than being a concocted fantasy that you are required to learn with your very salvation hinging on knowing it inside out.
In the Central Europe branch territory, a special campaign was organized. Actually, the School for Branch Committee members triggered an evaluation how much territory in the countries we oversee is not really covered thoroughly. So we asked our circuit overseers to recommend us which sections of the congregation's territory could be listed as so-called unassigned territory. All in all, we received over 11,000 territories from the congregations with approximately 3 million inhabitants. So because of this grand scale, there was suddenly the idea, why not organizing a special preaching campaign to cover all these territories on one single weekend? This was really exciting. And after getting the branch committee's approval, the service department started to organize it.
This was an interesting little segment. So we're taken to the Cedars branch office, I guess you'd call it Central European branch, whatever it is they're calling it these days. And we're told this story about a special initiative. They had the brainwave that perhaps not all of Germany was being covered on a regular basis. Maybe if they put the call-outs, they'd find that there were significant chunks of territory where people were being called on hardly at all. Bear in mind that the whole premise of the Jehovah's Witness religion is that the end is imminent and that the good news of God's kingdom needs to be preached in all the inhabited earth, even in the most remote parts of the Amazonian rainforest. Wherever there are people, we need to reach them with this urgent message because it's a matter of life or death. In Germany, they do some research and they put the call out to the circuit overseers and they find actually there are 11,000 territories in Germany representing 3 million people that are hardly being preached to. And this is in a country like Germany, one of the most, you could say, well-established countries in terms of, you know, the presence of Jehovah's Witnesses. And there are 3 million people who aren't being preached to regularly. And the solution is, well, never mind, at least we'll preach to them in one weekend. Honestly, this is something they're proud of. But if you're a Jehovah's Witness watching this, I would have questions about how this fits in with making sure each and every person is reached with the good news, because Armageddon is imminent. You're telling me that, oh, never mind, we tried to preach to them in one weekend, job done.
The campaign took place on one weekend in May 2017 and was especially successful in metropolitan areas, as in Berlin, Hamburg or Düsseldorf.
At one door, a man just arrived. He wanted to open his shop where he sells Arabian specialties. We were able to show him a video in Arabic. Then he gave us his address and phone number. He also agreed to have someone visit him again.
Yes, it's really a privilege to join in such a campaign and to see that every human is precious to Jehovah, no matter where they live or where they come from.
Not sure about that. Every human being precious to Jehovah, no matter where they live, no matter where they come from. We're already hearing about one well-established country, Germany, where there are 11,000 parts of the country where people are hardly ever being spoken to. 3 million people, in fact, in one well-established, developed country. That's before we even start thinking about the vast swathes of the planet where Jehovah's Witnesses are virtually unheard of. Go to Morocco. Go to Tunisia. Go to Western Sahara. Go to Libya. Go to Jordan. Go to Syria. Go to Iraq. Go to China and report back on just how many people have heard about Jehovah's Witnesses. I've argued repeatedly in these rebuttals, so I don't want to repeat myself too much, but it simply cannot be said that Jehovah is equally covering everybody, no matter where they live, no matter what country they're in. Jehovah is making sure they get the truth. Just simply cannot be said. If Armageddon comes tomorrow, which is what Jehovah's Witnesses are praying for, a disproportionate number of the inhabitants of the new world, or those that make it through Armageddon, shall we say, will be from the Americas, will be from Europe, will be from southern and central Africa, will be from Australia, parts of Asia, but by no means all of Asia. And that's about it. if you're from the Middle East, or if you're from communist parts of Asia, or if you're from North Africa, I'm sorry, likelihood is you're toast. And this is the God who isn't partial deciding this.
Because of the need and the fantastic response in 2017, it was decided to repeat such a campaign in May 2018. And this time it was expanded to Switzerland, Austria, Luxembourg and Liechtenstein. And now imagine, over 32,000 publishers participated, which is actually over 60% more than in May 2017. This was really faith strengthening, and again, a lot of wonderful experiences were reported.
I'm sure they were, and we're going to hear just how wonderful these experiences were. Bear in mind, we've already heard one experience, one of the most compelling experiences that they can muster for this initiative involves an Arabian-speaking man outside his shop that sells Arabian spices having a conversation and agreeing to hand over his contact details. That's the most compelling experience that they can come up with from their 2017 initiative. So you can only imagine how compelling the stories are going to be 1 year later. But going back to what I was saying about this whole story and how Watchtower seems proud of the fact that there are huge pockets in established countries where people aren't being witnessed to, we're now being told, oh, actually, we found the same problem in Austria, Liechtenstein, Switzerland and Luxembourg. No biggie. We'll set aside another weekend. That will solve the problem. I want to know, by the way, so we've gone from 3 million in Germany. What's the number of people who barely get preached to in Austria, Liechtenstein, Switzerland and Luxembourg? We don't get that figure, but I want to know it. Because again, how can you say that the world is receiving this fantastic witness and everyone, no matter where they live, is receiving the good news of God's kingdom, when Watchtower is finding, and even seems to be proud of the fact that it's finding, that even in countries where I almost said the truth, even in countries where the organization is well established, there are pockets of the territory where people just don't get preached to.
It's incredible. No matter where you are in Berlin, you can see small groups of brothers everywhere. That was really great.
In the ministry, we met a woman and she told us that she had just prayed for a Bible study. We are now more than ever convinced that Jehovah leads all this work through his angels.
Hold on a minute. So, the most compelling experience, the flagship experience from 2017 was the Arabian-speaking dude who hands over his contact details. That's the most compelling experience from the 2017 campaign. In 2018, we're hearing that, well, there were lots of witnesses in Berlin. It was really encouraging. And just one example of a fantastic experience, we met someone who'd only just been praying for a Bible study. Ta-da! Same logic that we heard before. Isn't it interesting? We heard it with Rita. We heard it with Nancy. And again, it says nothing. It tells us nothing. All it tells us is that people pray to learn more about the Bible or to have a closer relationship with God. There is nothing at all surprising about that. I would be more surprised if nobody was praying to become closer to God or to learn about the Bible. And of course, if you have an organization that makes it its business to recruit people by promising them a close relationship with God and promising them a better understanding of the Bible, sooner or later the two are going to meet. But this apparently is top of the list in terms of compelling experiences from this amazing campaign that happened in 2018.
Today, Sunday, we had a nice experience. A woman called us from behind. She had actually already passed us, but she had a feeling she had to go back again, she told us later. After she had invited us to her home, we exchanged our contact information and could also fill in the online contact form. Had we been in the territory just 1 minute later, we would never have made the contact. This must have been guided by the angels.
Oh, please. So this is what the angels are up to. They're not stopping suffering. They're not stopping children from dying. They're not stopping people dying in road traffic accidents. God lets that sort of thing happen. Somewhere in Germany, his priority is making sure that a woman walks down a certain street at a certain time so that she can encounter Jehovah's Witnesses. That's the priority. Either God is interventionist or he isn't, and you're on very shaky ground if you're going to start attributing such trivial things as this to Jehovah's doing. A woman walks past some witnesses, does a double take, decides to go back, they end up getting into a conversation and they exchange contact details. And that's the most compelling story you have to share with us. All I'm learning from this segment and similar segments that we routinely see in these JW broadcasting episodes where they're talking about the cart witnessing and they're talking about how wonderful the preaching work is, all I'm seeing is evidence of its failure. All I'm seeing is evidence that it makes no difference at all and is hardly having any effect. Watchtower knows, surely, that the way the organisation is keeping its head above water numerically is through child indoctrination, is through hijacking the developmental phase of children and persuading them to be Jehovah's Witnesses before they're old enough to realise that it's nonsense. That's how Jehovah's Witnesses are growing, not through the preaching work. And if anything, propaganda segments like these, with these entirely underwhelming experiences, only serve to underscore that fact.
Yesterday morning, while in the ministry, a young man ran after us and asked us what we were doing. We explained it to him. He asked us why there is still so much evil in the world then. In the afternoon, we were able to call on him again. We could start a Bible study right away and arrange a return visit, which we will make today.
Being together with friends is just so great. You're out and about with a large group. You meet up again regularly to change partners and to relate experiences. It's just great.
I can fully understand why it's just great from the point of view of witnesses coming together and socializing and being able to love bomb each other. Yeah, I can understand that. I imagine that if I'd been a witness in Germany during these campaigns, I would have had a great time meeting new people, feeling like I'm doing something purposeful. But again, the experiences are entirely underwhelming. Some guy asks a question about suffering and details are exchanged. And they use this phrase, start a Bible study. If you actually understand how this cart witnessing, metropolitan witnessing works, start a Bible study simply means, yes, we persuaded them to hand over their contact details so that we could call back on them. That's all it means when they say start a Bible study. So the fact that they are crowing about this as though it's some massive accomplishment, I mean, consider how much time has passed since these campaigns. The first one was in 2017, the second one was in 2018, we're now at the end of 2019. You would think that there's enough time there for something truly extraordinary to have happened, so that perhaps someone that they met in these campaigns went from approaching the carts to actually becoming baptized. I don't know, even being a pioneer, because that's how quickly they fast-track people nowadays. It's not inconceivable that that would happen, but no such story. Instead, it's, oh, we had conversations and managed to get contact details. Job done. Not convincing at all.
Thousands of videos were shown and a lot of Bible studies were started. And what is very interesting, a lot of publishers felt motivated to expand their ministry after the campaign. For sure, these preaching campaigns truly prove that Jehovah and Jesus are directing the preaching work, and the angels are helping us in reaching out to all people. We really have a lot of reasons to be Jehovah's happy people.
Jehovah truly proved to be with all who volunteered to share in this campaign. How else could the good news reach 3 million people in such a well-organized way?
I think Izak has here strayed into saying something that is just not true, or at least, at the very least, cannot be proven. Izak has here said that 3 million people were reached with the good news as a result of these campaigns. The 3 million figure we learned was from Germany alone, and for the 2017 campaign, which prompted a weekend to be set aside for special activity. Where is Izak's evidence that every one of the 3 million people who live in those territories was reached? Where's his evidence? I've covered this before about the dishonesty and the theocratic warfare. Whether Izak has even thought about this in any detail, probably he hasn't. Probably he's just, oh yeah, so they reached 3 million people, got it. So that's one of the things that I can say that's positive about this. It's more than likely that he just hasn't thought it through, but it's still dishonest.
Did you notice how many people were contacted soon after they prayed for a Bible study or for a question to be answered? Isn't that interesting?
No, it's not interesting at all. And what would be interesting, in fact, would be to compare this propaganda with propaganda from Mormons or propaganda from Pentecostals. Because I'm pretty sure, in fact, I would put money on it. And if you happen to be a Mormon or you happen to be a Pentecostal or, I don't know, any similar group, feel free to drop links in the comments if you know of a video where exactly the same claim gets made on their propaganda. Because of course they're going to make the same claim in Mormon propaganda or in Pentecostal propaganda or whatever. It's simply not a convincing argument at all.
The officers want us to renounce our faith, so they told me to lay on the ground, and there they started to beat me. The whole camp was around, and one of the prisoners fainted. So I started to pray to Jehovah, Jehovah, help me to be able to endure that. It was very severe pain, and I felt his help, because after a few beatings, my body felt numb. I don't feel much more of pain. One of the prisoners said to me, if I get out of here alive, I will tell my children that in the concentration camp, I've seen the Christians remind me with the first century Christians that they were happy even to die without renouncing their faith.
So yes, there's a heavy dose of persecution porn in the November 2019 JW Broadcasting episode. We're hearing here the story of an elderly witness talking about his persecution in Egypt circa 1967. Apparently Egypt is representative of how most countries treat Jehovah's Witnesses. But yeah, this plays in entirely to the narrative that witnesses get fed over and over again. We are God's one and only true organization because we're persecuted. Jesus said that his followers would be persecuted. And hey, we've had to go back a few decades, but here we found a really compelling story of some witnesses getting beaten in a concentration camp in Egypt. So therefore, our religion is true. Never mind the stories of other religious minorities in other totalitarian regimes, including today, who are suffering similar treatment. And in fact, I subscribe to Vice News, and just literally today I was looking at some recaps of a recent story by Isabel Jung on the Uyghurs in China and how appallingly they are being treated. They're being separated from their children. They're being herded into tiny rooms where they literally just have a bucket in the corner to serve as their toilet. And there's a systematic campaign to eradicate their culture and their faith in China. But you're not going to hear Watchtower talking about that or about any other religious minorities who are getting persecuted or oppressed in any way. They're only going to talk about stories from their own history, ignoring the fact that it's commonplace for totalitarian regimes to single out groups that they perceive to be a threat, particularly groups where there is some kind of cultural identity, some kind of society or organization that considers itself separate from the world in general. Some totalitarian regimes react badly to those sorts of groups, as we're seeing in Russia. Watchtower comes along and says, well, this just proves that we're God's organization. Sorry, not compelling.
One of the officers, this, nasty one that used to beat us very, very severely, came one day and he said, we need two of you to come out and write a report about what do you believe. So we thought about, is it wise to do that, or maybe they use it against us? Pray to Jehovah for help to make a decision here, to guide us what to do. So in the end, we reached a point that, well, we may get out, may not. So might as well give them a witness. I told the officer, we need a Bible. And he said, what for? I said to him, because we need to quote from the Bible in this report. So he said, okay, you have a Bible in the storeroom? I said, yes, I have a Bible. He said, okay, go and get your Bible. Went to my bag and picked up the Bible. So I picked up the Bible off my hand, opened it randomly, and started to read. Numbers. He looked at me, who wrote this book? I said to him, Moses. He said, you're a liar, on the top of his voice. So I kept quiet, and he closed the book again and opened it again. Musa. You are a liar, again, on top of his head. I was racing in my mind where it is written in the Bible that Jehovah told Moses to write any of this. He shut the book again for a third time and opened it again, and he started to read in a loud voice.
وقال الرب لموسى اكتب هذا تذكارا في الكتاب وضعه في مسامع يشوع.
So the officer looked at me with big surprise on his face. After we wrote the report, so I asked him, can we keep the Bible, please? He said, okay, keep the Bible. For 3 months, nearly every day, the officer comes in and beat us and expect us to compromise. We never did that.
I've got a few things to say about this. The first being that this entire story within this testimonial of the officer who demands that the witnesses write a report, and the witnesses use this opportunity to basically get their Bible back. This whole part of the story goes on for nearly 2.5 minutes. So Watchtower has devoted 2.5 minutes of their JW broadcasting episode, bearing in mind that typically a testimonial will last for, I'm going to say 5 or 6 minutes. That's to cover someone's life story. And here Watchtower are devoting 2.5 minutes to this particular story. So clearly Watchtower finds this to be an important story that witnesses need to hear about. But then when you look at the details of the story, There is absolutely nothing remarkable about it. You have this officer who sets the task of telling the witnesses to write this report. They ask for their Bible. He ends up asking a bunch of questions about the Bible and seems particularly interested in the authorship of the Pentateuch or certain books of the Pentateuch. He singles out the book of Numbers, one of the books of the Pentateuch, and says, who wrote this? The witness says Moses wrote it, and the officer says, you're a liar. Okay, well, we then have to ask the question, who did write Numbers? Was it Moses? Then the same question gets asked of Deuteronomy. Who wrote this book? Who wrote Deuteronomy? Same answer, Moses. Again, you're a liar. Did Moses write Deuteronomy? Witnesses and many fundamentalist Christians would say, yes, Moses absolutely wrote Deuteronomy. Bible scholars will have a different answer for you. And just to give you one example of why that is, I find it interesting that Deuteronomy was picked, by the way, out of the books of the Pentateuch, because let me refer you to Deuteronomy chapter 34. In Deuteronomy chapter 34 and verse 5, it says, after that, Moses, the servant of Jehovah, died there in the land of Moab, just as Jehovah had said. So Moses wrote the words, after that, Moses, the servant of Jehovah, died there. Come on. Clearly, it cannot be said that Moses, you certainly can't say that Moses wrote all of the Pentateuch or all of the book of Deuteronomy if it includes an account of him dying. Clearly, at least somebody other than Moses has written, at the very least, that particular verse. And when scholars do their digging and they analyze these books, they come to the conclusion, first of all, that these books were written by multiple writers, and secondly, that there's no possible way that Moses could have written the Pentateuch, because the very first Bible books started to be written in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, not in the time period when Moses would have been around. In fact, I touched on this in my rebuttal to the Josiah drama, particularly the scene where they uncover the book of Moses when they're doing temple renovations. Oh, look what we've found. This long-lost book of Moses that we've all been living by, and only now have we found the original. No, they'd just written it. They didn't find it, they wrote it and then produced it as though they'd found it. I understand this is going to be rubbing a lot of people up the wrong way, but I'm only asking, and I think it's a fairly reasonable request, that before we start making dogmatic statements about who wrote the Pentateuch or who wrote whatever book, let's at least give scholars a say, based on scholars forensically scrutinizing the text, based on scholars comparing what the text says with various archaeological discoveries. We can't simply dismiss all of this. But going back to the segment, the real kind of, oh gosh moment, or the real epiphany comes when the guard opens up the Bible and randomly apparently starts reading, and he reads what apparently answers the question, so that the verse that the witness would ideally have done some research and found for him, the guard just stumbles on. I agree, it's a quite a big coincidence, but it's nevertheless not an impossible coincidence that he would just randomly start reading and read something that apparently seems to answer the question. But it's interesting that they quote from, I believe, Exodus 17, verse 14, where it says, Jehovah now said to Moses, write this as a memorial in the book, and repeat it to Joshua. And the way that Watchtower quotes this verse is as if to say, well, just write the book of Exodus and give it to Joshua. That's not what the verse says in context. It says, Jehovah now said to Moses, write this as a memorial in the book and repeat it to Joshua. I will completely wipe out the memory of Amalek from under the heavens. So this verse, this epiphany that this whole segment has been building up to, is actually based on a verse where Jehovah is promising to annihilate a people, to commit genocide against the people of Amalek, the Amalekites. And you might ask, when does this verse reach its fulfillment? Well, for that you need to go to 1 Samuel 15. Here's what it says in verses 2 and 3. This is what Jehovah of armies says, I will call to account the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they opposed them along their way coming up from Egypt. Now go and strike down the Amalekites and devote them to destruction along with all that they have. You must not spare them. You are to put them to death, man as well as woman, child as well as infant, bull as well as sheep, camel as well as donkey. Kill the animals, kill the donkeys, the sheep, the camels. Don't forget to kill the babies. I'm quite keen on you killing all Amalekites, including the babies. This is the verse that believers can be proud of. This is a verse that witnesses can point to because some guard in some Egyptian jail happened to stumble on a verse that alludes to this. And what's important is that it seemingly answered his question. It's not important that the verse alludes to one of the most grotesque passages that you will find in the whole of the Old Testament. And that's saying a lot because there's some really nasty stuff in the Old Testament. But how interesting that when you actually do the digging on what's being discussed here, you actually find that it's not quite as compelling as Watchtower would have us believe, even though they've made this, you could say, a central story in their 1 hour, 3 minute JW broadcasting episode, giving us a whole 2.5 minutes to dwell on this supposedly miraculous story.
At times I felt scared inside, only looking for a place to hide. The world made me feel different. Now I hold my head up high. He said it'd be my confidence, that he'd come to my defense. His love I can't deny, 'cause he gave me courage when I was feeling weak, courage when I could not speak, courage in my darkest night, courage to stand up tall, courage to face it all, courage to trust him with my life. Jehovah's always by my side. He walks with me to help me see his ways are always right. Jehovah's always by my side. He'll take my hand, help me understand it's worth the sacrifice.
So yes, I'm afraid there's a music video that we need to talk about, and it's about courage, and it's about witnesses remembering that whatever they have to go through in order to become witnesses. It's worth the sacrifice. Interesting lyric that, isn't it? Coming from a religion that calls for the ultimate sacrifice when it comes to the need to refuse blood transfusions. But I did find it interesting that you have a repeat of this, again, counter-narrative that we saw earlier in the episode, where Nancy and her husband were talking about being opposed due to their decision to join Jehovah's Witnesses. And here you have a depiction of a lady apparently telling what appears to be her mother that she's becoming a witness, or at least showing her the What Can the Bible Teach Us book. And the lady, again, presumably her mother, acts in a very aggressive way so that the girl can then be seen going back to her car with a box apparently carrying her belongings. She's been kicked out of the house. Again, it's just disgraceful, if I'm interpreting this correctly, for Watchtower to be suggesting that they're the ones who get shunned. It's not that they're breaking apart families and encouraging parents to kick their children out if they stop believing or err in any way. No, we're the victims. We want to play the victim card here because of a few isolated stories where an individual of their own volition reacts in a bad way to someone studying with the witnesses. This means that we're the ones being persecuted, even though we organisationally mandate parents to shun their children. So that it's not a personal choice. They couldn't have contact with their disfellowshipped children even if they wanted to, because we have told the parents that they're going to die at Armageddon unless they show loyalty. We're expected to believe that both situations are somehow the same, or that it's worse in some way for Jehovah's Witnesses to be oppressed. But I, for one, am not falling for it.
Courage when you're feeling weak. Courage when you cannot speak. Courage in your darkest nights. Courage to stand up tall. Courage to face it all. Courage to trust Him with your life. Jehovah's always by our side. Always, always. Jehovah's always by our side. He walks with you and me. Always. To help us see. Always. His ways are always right. Jehovah's always by our side. He'll take our hand, help us understand. It's worth the sacrifice.
So we're here watching these individuals get baptized, but all I can think about is how culty these lyrics are. Courage to trust Him with your life, I believe, was one of the lyrics. So witnesses have to trust Jehovah or Jehovah's organization with their life. Nothing alarming there, folks. And you also get repeated the lyric, it's worth the sacrifice. Well, again, the more you learn about Jehovah's Witnesses, the more you learn that actually they get you to sacrifice quite a lot.
It was so hard for me to turn down that girl at school. And I felt so guilty for how involved I had gotten with her. My uncle used the Bible to help me get back on track and to remind me of two other very important things: that Jehovah was proud of me and that I was not alone. James 1:2-3 says, "Consider it all joy, my brothers, when you meet with various trials, knowing as you do that this tested quality of your faith produces endurance." I think about that scripture a lot because soon I'll probably be sent to prison for refusing military service. Being courageous with that classmate helped me build the faith and courage that I need now. I can give up anything for Jehovah. I might live in a small cell for now, but in paradise, I'm going to travel everywhere.
I really hope that Lucas is resurrected so I can show him around paradise and teach him more about Jehovah. I showed him pictures, but the real thing will be so much better.
This was a very unexpected turn towards the end of the JW Broadcasting episode, where it does some kind of recap of propaganda material that's been shown in past episodes, including this story, which basically amounts to promoting the organization's culture of sexual repression, where the boy isn't allowed to pursue any kind of romance with the girl at school who likes him, and apparently he likes her, but because she's not a believer, there can't be anything between them. Watchtower again inserts itself in people's lives to this degree, where perfectly normal, perfectly innocent relationships aren't even allowed to begin to form because of ideological differences. But then it goes off on this wild tangent where James 1 verses 2 and 3 gets quoted, "Consider it all joy, my brothers, when you meet with various trials." And the guy from that dramatization, which again was more about sexual repression more than anything, then adds on to the story that, oh, and I'm about to go to jail probably because of being a conscientious objector.
I think about that scripture a lot, because soon I'll probably be sent to prison for refusing military service.
Bear in mind that this particular video seems to have been produced by the Korean arm of the audio-visual department. So it's supposed to be set in South Korea, but we've already heard in a JW Broadcasting episode not so long ago that the Korean government has stopped imprisoning young Jehovah's Witnesses for conscientious objection. In fact, this was even proclaimed as being evidence that Jehovah intervenes on behalf of his people. Look at this great victory that we've achieved.
In 2018, a series of court rulings in South Korea finally recognized conscientious objection to military service for religious reasons as a fundamental human right, and our brothers were gradually released from their prison bonds. What do you think? Did Jehovah hear our prayers in behalf of these dear brothers? As a worldwide brotherhood, there can be no doubt that our incessant prayers to Jehovah were a major factor in these marvelous developments, and we praise and thank Jehovah that he's heard our prayers.
And yet, just a few months later, they're still harping on about conscientious objectors being imprisoned in Korea in this particular dramatization, which again is a rehashing of an old dramatization on an entirely different theme. I'm flabbergasted. They're tying themselves up in knots in their desperation to make witnesses feel persecuted, to the point where they're forgetting which countries have actually relented in their persecution. It really is bizarre. And you also have this footage where, and I've talked about this before, by the way, I think this video made it into my worst 10 JW Broadcasting moments of all time. It's this disgraceful video where children are guilt-tripped out of celebrating birthdays to the extent where they're not allowed to sign a birthday card for a classmate who is seriously ill. And again, as we saw in the last story, they layer on another aspect of the story that wasn't alluded to, or at least I'm pretty sure it wasn't alluded to in the original, which is that the classmate, Lucas, was actually dying and did die, apparently, as though the story couldn't get even more disturbing. It just has. And the witness boy is saying, oh, well, I really hope he gets resurrected so I can show him around paradise and teach him more about Jehovah. Well, those of you who saw the original video will know how inappropriate it was, the circumstances in which he was teaching Lucas about Jehovah to begin with. The family goes round to visit Lucas's parents, and this kid breaks off from them and sneaks into Lucas's room, whips out his great teacher book, and starts trying to indoctrinate his schoolmate in his schoolmate's bedroom, in his schoolmate's home, without the permission of his schoolmate's parents. This is what witness children should be thinking about doing, apparently. Sneaking into their schoolmates' homes to indoctrinate them, you know, even to the point of exploiting a time of sadness when, as we're now learning, the schoolmate is fatally ill. And to add insult to injury, the story now becomes, oh, well, I'll get to maybe show him around paradise. Maybe show him the part of paradise where his parents are buried because they didn't become Jehovah's Witnesses before Armageddon came. I mean, I showed him pictures, but the real thing will be so much better.
Our program has focused on the many ways that Jehovah is with us. He's with us as we work toward dedication and baptism. He's with us at our congregation meetings and when we are with our spiritual family. He's with us as we successfully face persecution and hardship. And Jehovah is with us when we share the good news of His kingdom with everyone we meet. And Brother Marais, I appreciate that you were here with me for this month's program.
Thank you, Brother Loesch.
So that mercifully brings us to the end of this month's JW Broadcasting episode. Again, just a bizarre dynamic, wasn't it? Between Gerrit Losch, who's clearly not on top form at the moment, and Izak Marais, who I just think of him as Lösch. There's just so little going on there in terms of any kind of presence or charisma. And yet they put these two together to front this flagship show. I suppose it's just as well, really, because if I find them utterly unconvincing as hosts, maybe witnesses are in with a chance. Maybe despite how manipulative and heart-tugging a lot of this material is, maybe just these breaks where it switches to Izak Marais or Gerrit Losch being utterly dull and dreary, maybe those gaps will just give witnesses the pause that they need to think, what on earth is going on here? What am I being asked to swallow? Oh, Jehovah gives people in Sri Lanka 10,000 rupees, but allows children to die. 9 million children a year to die. And that's his priority. Jehovah allows children to be molested, but he at least organises preaching campaigns in Central Europe to reach millions of people that should have been being reached anyway if the good news of the kingdom really is being preached in all the inhabited earth. There's so much to go on for Jehovah's Witnesses in this one episode alone, if they can only bring themselves to think and apply some critical thinking skills. But that's pretty much everything I have for you for this month's rebuttal. There will now be a break because typically Watchtower doesn't release JW Broadcasting episodes for December and January, so I get a bit of a break, but it's not much of a break because next month I will be doing my Worst of 2019 compilation, so look out for that. We will also be looking back as a Watchtower in Focus team on some of the key events of 2019. That will be right towards the end of December. And in January, I will be giving you a rebuttal to the annual meeting footage that I anticipate will be released by Watchtower in the coming week. So no rest for the wicked. I'm still going to be busy, and I hope you enjoy the videos to come. But that's everything for now. Don't forget to subscribe to the John Cedars channel for all of these videos, and as always, thank you for watching.